أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be on you. Welcome back to another episode of Islam in Focus. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid. Today we have our concluding program in our series dealing with the Quran and modern sciences. I have joining me on the program, as usual, Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
We're back for what I hope will be another interesting program. It's our concluding program, as I mentioned in this series. Could I have you very quickly at the beginning of today's program summarize the main points that we touched on in our last program dealing with human reproduction?
Sure. In the last program, we tried to analyze the amazing description of the various embryonic stages as appear in the Quran in Surah 23. It's all the way from the description of the uterus as being placed in a firmly established lodge, and we described that from the anatomical standpoint, describing what happens to the small drop of liquid that it transforms into something that clings, and we analyze that also from the anatomical standpoint, literally clinging to the uterus wall. Thirdly, we talked about the transformation of that thing that clings into a chewed lump of flesh, and we showed a slide that shows that it appears as if there are marks of teeth there. By the way, these are called scientifically the somites, S-O-M-I-T-E-S, the thing that looks like teeth in that stage. And then the stage that the Quran describes as the formation of bones and clothing the bones with, that is, intact flesh, that is the muscles, which happen usually between the 5th to the 7th week. And then beyond that, the Quran also says that then we created, that is the human, as a different or another creature. And in that we compare the different embryological stages of various animals vis-a-vis the human, and we have seen again that they are very similar, but only in that later stages distinct features of the embryo as an embryo, or fetus I should say, of a human becomes more clear. And finally we said that this creation after creation takes place in three veils of darkness.
This expression, three veils of darkness, is an interesting one. Could you perhaps explain what is meant by it?
Okay, perhaps we can refer first to its mention in the Quran, to the text of the passage, which might be interesting. In Surah 39, in Ayah 6, it says, يَخْلُقُكُمْ خَلْقًا مِنْ بَعْدِ خَلْقٍ فِي ظُلُمَاتٍ ثَلَاثٍ. That is, He, Allah, fashions you inside the bodies of your mothers, formation after formation, in three veils of darkness. Now, what these three veils might mean, some interpret that or explain it like Bouquet mentioned, for example, as the three anatomical layers which protect the fetus, namely the abdominal wall, the uterus itself, and the surrounding of the fetus. Another way of looking at it is that if you take the surrounding of the fetus itself, you find that it is also three. You can talk about the placenta, the embryonic membrane, and the amniotic fluid. So again, the term three is perfectly applicable. Another interesting opinion or interpretation given in the translation or the interpretation of the Quran called Al-Muntakhab, which was published in Cairo, which says again that this could be a reference to the ovaries, to the fallopian tube, and the uterus. And that's an interesting one, because these are also three veils of darkness. There are mysterious things. That's the formation first of the ovum, and then the fertilization, the fallopian tube, and of course the growth that takes place in the uterus. So that could also be another possible reference. Another interpretation, which is again consistent with this, it's not contradictory at all with it, is the one that Dr. Muhammad Al-Bar offers, that this could be in reference to the 3 layers in the uterus itself, that is, closer examination of the uterus of a pregnant mother shows that there are 3 layers. One is the amnion, that is surrounding the fetus immediately, and then there is the chorion, which provide nutrients and oxygen and so on to the fetus, and then there is another layer which is called decidua. It spells D-E-C-I-D-U-A, which is actually a membrane that is cast off at the time of birth. The interesting thing about it here is that the expression in the Quran itself is a miracle, because it just describes, let's say, 3 veils of darknesses, which is a broader term that a simple person in the past could have understood, and the more we develop the scientific knowledge, the more we see secrets and more aspects of the miracle of the interpretation or the expression that we find in the Quran. So science changed, while the expressions in the Quran remain accurate depending on our level of understanding.
Well, in the last program we were seeing the development of the fetus. We saw with different facial expressions and appearances of crying and smiling and so on. What about the development of the senses? Is there anything about that in the Quran?
Yes, indeed. In the Quran, generally speaking, we find that hearing is put before sight. Not only this, but I would say that in 100% of the passages in the Quran that deals with creation, I'm specifying deals with the creation, always, without a single failure, you find that hearing is mentioned before sight. Let me just give you a couple of examples that might indicate this. For example, in Surah 76, in Ayah 2, إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. Translating in the meaning, verily we, that God, created the humankind from a drop of a mingled liquid in order to try or test him, so we gave him the gifts of hearing and sight. In Surah 32, in Ayah 9, you have a similar expression also, وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ, that Allah has appointed for you the sense of hearing, sight, and intellect. And these are not the only passages in the Quran that mention that. You can find similar expressions, for example, in 46:26, in 10:31, 16:78, in 67:23. All of them always place the hearing before the sight. Now the question here is, what does it mean really in scientific terms to put the sight, the hearing before the sight? That's right. That could have 2 meanings. One, a reference to the learning process and the relative importance of each of these 2 senses. Of course, the sight and hearing are both important. However, if you get a child who is born, let's say, blind at the time of birth, but can hear, he can still learn. He learn language and lots of other things. He could be even a genius, despite of his blindness. However, if you have a child born deaf, there's no learning that can take place. It's very difficult.
Yes.
You see. So again, that could be a reference to the relative importance in terms of learning process. But from the embryological standpoint, we find that even the very beginning of the formation of the inner ear start in about the 22nd day, as we notice in this coming slide here, that very early, even in the stage which the Quran calls mudgha, or the chewed lump of flesh, the ear begins to be distinct. And even the outer ear itself becomes quite clear in the 8th week of pregnancy. In the 4th month, it starts to grow and become even much more distinct. if you notice here in the upper one, there is a little arrow. The ear is very difficult, or the outer ear might be rather difficult to see in this one, but we try to have a sort of marker around the ear, and the arrow is pointing to this. And here we're talking about the perhaps the end of the second month, even, of pregnancy, whereas the lower one shows the ear in the 4th month. In fact, we are told also that in the beginning of the 5th month, the ear is completely formed, and the fetus, in fact, begins to hear the voice, the sounds around him. He might hear the sound, for example, of the pulse of his mother, the noise around him or her, of course, and the fetus can sleep and all of that noise, wake up in that noise, but it has been shown that he actually can listen.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does this compare with the development of sight?
Well, we can say also that the very early stages of the development of sight takes place also very early, like perhaps even the 3rd week. However, the development of the eye does not, come to full fruition, or come to be really completed, except in the perhaps around the 7th month. That is the full development of the eye. And in that slide here, we notice 2 stages actually. The first one is in the 8th week of pregnancy. That's the one on the left-hand side. And you notice here, while the eyebrows just began to form, the eye has not really taken the full shape. Whereas on the other one, on the right-hand side, this is an actual photograph of a fetus in the towards the end of the 5th month, about 20 weeks of pregnancy. And you notice there that the eyelids are all closed, they are joined, and it does not separate until perhaps about the 7th month, in preparation for the fetus, coming to this world. It's interesting to notice when you look at the eyes on that picture on the right-hand side, the beginning of the opening, it almost looks like something that's being split. Mm-hmm. See? And that is of particular interest, because one of the prayers that Prophet Muhammad taught his followers to say when they are in the prostration, in prayers, سجد وجهي للذي خلقه وشق سمعه وبصره فتبارك الله أحسن الخالقين, which means that my face prostrated to He who created it, and who split, shaq, exactly, who split its hearing and its sight. So blessed be Allah, the best to create. And that's quite interesting. From the anatomical standpoint, we are told that the beginning of the hearing also involves some kind of splitting, so that the full capacity of the ear becomes or comes into operation. And again, as has been seen in that slide, there's also a kind of splitting in the eyelids, so that the eye opens again for the second time in preparation for birth in the 7th month. Mm-hmm. So it's quite an interesting expression, even the term split.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to digress too much, but I know there's a wives' tale that used to be propagated that when the baby was first born, that they weren't able to see. Obviously, from what you've said, that would be untrue.
Probably not. We don't know exactly, but it's quite possible that they may not be able to focus or concentrate their sight as much as when they grow a little later. But as far as hearing, you can test that even with a recently born baby. Just produce a sound, and the baby would look at it. Mm-hmm. The baby, for example, in the very early stage, is able to hear his mother and recognize her voice. So it appears that the hearing is
more advanced.
Definitely.
But I'd like to raise another issue now, in addition to the questions that we've been discussing of the physical development, and that is in the development of the senses that we've just been discussing, and that is the soul. When does it begin in the fetus?
Well, first of all, maybe I should just make a comment here that when we talk about the soul, the way the Quran uses it, is not necessarily synonymous with biological life, because we have seen that biological life starts even with a fertilized ovum. I mean, the potential for life and the genetic code is always there. And that's why the Quran, when it describes that, it says that this is something that relates to Allah, or Allah knows more about the nature of the soul. So we're really talking about perhaps the spirituality of the individual beyond biological life. As far as the Quran mention of this, we find that there is no specification of any particular time frame in which the soul comes into being, that is in the fetus. All we find is such passages like the one in Surah 32 in 6 through 9, that Allah created the human ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِهِ, that Allah fashioned the human and then breathed into him something of his spirit, which is again the spiritual part of the human. But as far as the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on that, we find that a famous saying that has been quoted quite frequently, narrated both in Bukhari and Muslim, reads like this in translation. It says, one of you is created in the inside the body of his mother for 40 days as a small quantity of liquid, and then he becomes something that clings like that, and then he becomes something that looks like a chewed lump of flesh like that, and then the angel breathes the soul into him. Some people has interpreted that, looking at the wording of this particular saying, as 40 as liquid, 40 something that clings, and 40 chewed lump, so that's 120 days or 4 months. But this is not necessarily the correct interpretation of that saying, because there have been so many other sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which gives a different indication. There have been lots of scholars who studied this saying and put it together pertaining to this question of the soul, like Ibn al-Qayyim and others. And a very good summary of this is provided in the book by Dr. Muhammad al-Bar, looking at it both from the traditional or the saying of the Prophet point of view, as well as the medicine, being a physician himself. And in many of the other versions of this saying, especially ones like narrated in Ahmad, others narrated also in Muslim, seem to indicate that the breathing of the soul takes place between the 40th and 45th day. Some saying between 40 to 45, some say about 42 days. So we're talking here about the approximately the 7th week. And from the scientific standpoint, Dr. Al-Bar, for example, mentioned that the period of the formation or initial formation of the organs in the body actually take place between the 4th to the 8th week. And around the end of the 6th week, it becomes in the most active, most fast stage. In this stage, they usually refer to as organogenesis. So that's the peak of its activity around the 42nd day. Now, there is another aspect about the soul, and I'd like to say here at this point that we touched on that very briefly, because in a previous series on Muslim beliefs, we discussed in greater detail the notion of the soul and where it is and how does it come into being and where does it go after death and all that. So I didn't touch on that just to avoid too much overlap. But there is something really interesting which relates to this question of the soul also. Because you see, the soul refer also to the unique identity of every human being. Another aspect that refers to this unique identity refers to the question of the fingerprints. Let me start first with the citation from the Quran, and we're talking here again about Revelation, which is 1400 years old. In Surah 75, in passage 3 and 4, أَيَحْسَبُ الْإِنسَانُ أَن لَّن نَّجْمَعَ عِظَامَهُ بَلَا قَادِرِينَ عَلَى أَن نُّسَوِّيَ بَنَانَهُ, which means, does the human think that we cannot assemble his bones, that is in the day of judgment after death. Nay, we, that's God, are able to put together or fashion the very tips of his fingers. Now, there is something really interesting about finger prints. And if you look at this slide, you notice the specific code or specific formation. And scientists tell us that there is absolutely no two human beings, even twins, who have identical fingerprints. It's a really strange thing. In other words, you have billions of people living through thousands or tens of thousands of years, and never two fingerprints are identical, which again is a reference to this unique identity of each human. How could the Prophet have known of this fact that was discovered relatively recently after a very, meticulous analysis of the fingerprints? And why did the Quran specifically mention fingerprints? Another equally interesting thing is that not only do we find uniqueness in the fingerprints, but also in the writing in the forehead in the early stages also of the development of the fetus. This slide has been shown also in a previous program. We're looking at it now from a slightly different standpoint. While it might not look very clear, but you notice also that there are some kind of writing also, or similar designs, if you will, similar to the design of the fingerprints in the forehead of the fetus. And it's interesting to note that in one of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as narrated in Al-Bazzar, it says that when the child is in the process of creation, or the fetus is in the process of the creation, then it says everything about his future will be written and between his eyes, or that's in the forehead. And it says that even a disaster that the person may encounter in his lifetime would be written, that is in between the eyes, that is in the forehead. And it was found again that this writing or design in the forehead does not, drastically, substantially differ from one person to the other. So each person has that unique writing again. It's interesting to notice also that this writing disappeared after a while. In other words, this photograph was the earlier one was taken earlier, but later on you notice here that fellow is scratching his forehead. And in fact the writing seemed to have disappeared under layers of fat, as if to conceal this from anyone who tried to interpret them or find out what the person is going to face in his lifetime. It's just an interesting area that science even has not reached the limit in understanding what it means.
Well, we have palm readers, but not forehead readers.
Right. Maybe that might be the next thing, if you get enough sample of fetus pictures.
What about the question of childbirth? Does the Quran have anything to say about that? And how does it relate to modern discoveries of medicine?
Well, to start first with the Quran, in Surah 80, in passage 20, من نطفة خلقه فقدره ثم السبيل يسره, describing the process of formation of the fetus and birth. It says that from a small quantity of liquid or sperm, he, that's God or Allah, has created him or her, and then mold him in due proportion. Then does he make the way easy for him. Make the way easy for him. Making the way easy, of course, could be a reference to the process of development of the fetus. That could be one possible way of looking at it. But it seems also to refer to making the way easy to come out, that is in the process of childbirth. As far as the scientific aspect of it, it is noted that the pelvic bones of the male and the female are rather different. You can notice that, for example, that in the case of the female pelvis, you find it relatively shorter and wider. And in addition to this, there are other aspects beside the design which seem to lend itself in the case of the female to relative ease of birth. But it was noted also that there is a certain hormone, pregnancy hormone, or known as the progesterone, which is secreted when the mother becomes pregnant, and that somehow loosens the ligaments which is holding the various pieces of these pelvic bones, so that it becomes a little bigger, so that, or more spacious, so as to accommodate the fetus. And at the time of birth also, another hormone is secreted. It's called relaxin, and you can tell perhaps from the name, relaxin. It literally relaxes, the pelvis and make it, bigger, flexible enough, so that it allows the baby to pass through. Let alone, of course, the amniotic liquid, or fluid, which also plays a role in facilitating the exit of the fetus. It is interesting to notice here that the expression in the Quran is not only sober, but it describes in a great deal of meticulous accuracy what exactly happens at the time of birth. That's the ease of getting out. Dr. Al-Bar mentioned something interesting also, which might sound remote, but it does refer also to what happened immediately after childbirth. In the story of Mary, Virgin Mary, that's in Surah 19, especially in passages 24 through 26, it says that when she was disturbed under the tree, when she started to give birth to Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, it says the angel came to her and he said to her that you should just touch or shake the palm tree, and God will cause to drop on you fresh dates, and that underneath you God has created also a rivulet, small river, so eat, that is from the date, fresh ripe dates, and drink and cool your eyes, assuring her. It's interesting to notice, as Dr. Barr explains, that the fresh ripe dates contains certain material which actually help in the contraction of the uterus, which would help also reduce the extent of bleeding. And that in addition to that, the fresh ripe dates also include or contains a number of sugars like the fructose and glucose, in addition to minerals and proteins, which is an excellent source of energy for a mother who just gave birth. And the rivulet is a reference also to the fluids, which is badly needed, of course, by the mother after childbirth. So while it talks about the story even of Jesus and Mary, peace be upon them both, it's interesting that it's used specifically the term, the fresh ripe dates.
Well, there are many other aspects that we perhaps could go into if time would permit, but in the concluding moments of today's program, could I perhaps ask you if there are any conclusions that you might want to make about this series, series of dealing with the Quran and the modern science?
Well, to start with, as we started earlier, dealing with this variety of questions that are raised about the source of the Quran, and we have seen that there are numerous evidence that we have discussed over so many programs from various aspects of science, that it sounds rather impossible that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would have known this, which negate any possibility that he might have copied this from some other sources, or just has been so intelligent and so smart that he anticipated sciences by 1400 years. Well, some people might do that in one science, but in all these varieties of expressions, things that has been discovered even as late as the last 10 or 20 years, is something really that should cause us to stop and ponder. What is the source of the Quran, and if it is not divine revelation that is revealed from Allah, the Creator, to the Prophet, where else could this information, with this meticulous description, has been obtained 1400 years ago?
Thank you, Brother Jamal. This has been a very interesting series dealing with Quran and modern science. We want to invite you back next week when we'll continue with our series dealing with the sources of Islam. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول